At night sometimes in certain parts of the city, usually in those remaining streets that are left deserted, usually in winter but sometimes in other seasons if the streets are sufficiently forsaken, the past can be seen as if through a smeared window. Sometimes this effect occurs only for an instant, when you're walking back from some place with a head crammed with company and music and sensations, to a point where all new sensations dissipate, on some dead street in the Middle West Side lined with jobbers and import showrooms and loading docks and shuttered luncheonettes, or on a street on the Lower East Side where the intersections have no stoplights and everything is nailed down and dark and the only people to be seen dart by as furtively as wraiths. There will be no traffic, and the streetlights will seem to shrink back into their globes, drawing their skirts of illumination into tight circles, and the rutted streets reveal the cobbles under a thin membrane of asphalt, and the buildings all around are masses of unpointed blackened brick, or cacophonies of terracotta bric-a-brac, or yawning cast-iron gravestones 6 or 8 stories tall. This is the sepulchre of New York, the city as a living ruin.
What's up, party people, and welcome back to another episode of NYC Foodways, your weekly food and culture discussion from the cultural capital of the world. My name is John, and this week's episode is dedicated to game developer John Carmack, creative genius and programmer extraordinaire who went from stealing computers and serving time in juvie to changing the history of digital entertainment. Today on NYC Foodways, we go on a walking tour to illuminate Lucy Santé's entrancing urban history, Low Life, Lures and Snares of Old New York. I first became familiar with Santé from her 2015 masterwork, The Other Paris, An Underground History of the City of Light, written when she went by the name Luke. In many ways, The Other Paris is a sequel to Low Life, as both books map the same aspects of their respective cities: the streets, the crowds, the poverty, the crime, the drugs, the politicians, the police, the prostitution, and much else one would find rarely discussed in a Lonely Planet guidebook. Low Life, which could have been accurately subtitled A People's History of the LES or How the Other Half Dies, was published in 1991 and covers, in the author's words, the roughly 80 years of the city's adolescence and early adulthood, from around 1840 until 1919. But a standard historical study of the city, this is not. It's the underbelly we're here to examine, specifically the underbelly of Lower Manhattan, with particular focus on areas in and around the Bowery. The ghosts of Manhattan, Santé writes, are not the spirits of the propertied classes. New York's ghosts are the unresting souls of the poor, the marginal, the dispossessed, the depraved, the defective, the recalcitrant. They are the guardian spirits of the urban wilderness in which they lived and died. Unrecognized by the history that is common knowledge, they push invisibly behind it to erect their memorials in the collective unconscious. I love it. And it is these spirits that will be our guides on today's walkabout. Let's get it. We might as well start with Broadway. New York's most famous street is also its oldest, and far before it was known for all it is known for today, it was a corridor of vice. According to Santé, it was said in the 1880s that you could stand on the corner of Broadway and Houston Street, where we are at this very moment, and fire a shotgun in any direction without hitting an honest man. But Broadway, despite its outsized role in the Common Era, is not the focus of Low Life. That would be the Bowery, this street right here, which was stamped early on with the brand of an idyllic spot gone to seed, and at some point this became an image of decline. It's hard to believe, with today's million-dollar condos, designer boutiques, and high-end hotels, that the Bowery, until fairly recently, possessed the greatest number of groggeries, flop houses, clip joints, brothels, fire sales, rigged auctions, pawnbrokers, dime museums, shooting galleries, dime dance establishments, fortune-telling salons, lottery agencies, thieves' markets, and tattoo parlors, as well as theaters of the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 10th rank. It is also a fact that the Bowery is the only major thoroughfare in New York never to have had a single church built on it. Santé is singularly focused on the Bowery as a locus of unexamined histories, as the forum of the slums, the strand where bodies spilling forth from the tightly packed blocks to the east and south could collect. It was to some degree an ethnically neutral zone. The Bowery was a great clearinghouse for migrants. Nearly anyone not of the gentry passing through New York would make his or her way there eventually. Naturally, Some halted there and never left, falling into the mire of drinking or prostitution, or getting themselves murdered for their boots or maimed for their good looks. Very early, the Bowery acquired a reputation as the last stop on the way down. In 2022, rooms at the Bowery Hotel start at around $400 a night. Sante posits the tenement as the building block of old New York, specifically the tenement of the Lower East Side. I happen to live in one, this one right here, and was horrified to learn that multiple families would have occupied the space I live in solo, a space that comfortably houses a single person. Something Sante calls to note that you may have been aware of in passing but never really took the time to pay attention to are the highly varied, heavily ornamented facades that clad these humble edifices. Since reading her words on the subject, I find myself forever scanning the buildings of my neighborhood, finding new and interesting details on every block. Commerce of the low-life era was heavily ambulatory, with items of all types hawked on the street. There's some neat discussions of 19th century NYC foodways here, how different sets of immigrants hawked different types of what was essentially the fast food of the time. And there's a really compelling overview of the so-called rag trade, which Sante describes as the lowest level of commerce. Rag pickers worked the city's ash heaps and garbage dumps and solicited door-to-door in residential areas, collecting unwanted, broken, or superannuated articles of every description. Rag pickers either reconditioned and repaired items salvaged from the refuse or gathered and resold bulk items like newspapers, wood, bones, and tin back to industry. They also hawked wares on the streets. This still occurs to this very day on the streets of New York. There are legions of folks who make their living, as it were, salvaging food to eat, items to sell, and recyclables to return. The New York of lowlife was a grim, in some ways nihilistic place. Did you know that one form of popular entertainment on the Bowery featured a contest to the death between men in heavy boots versus a large number of rats? Did you know that drinking places in and around the Bowery often served as layers of assisted suicide, selling alcohol heavily laced with poison to knowing customers? Did you know that back then, young women from poor families who harbored aspirations of economic advancement had only avenues of prostitution to pursue? Sante provides notable documentary evidence in the form of well-selected engravings, lithographs, and photographs. In addition, Lowlife is thoroughly researched with dozens of books used as source material. Lowlife is wonderful, but some readers may tire of the long-winded and detailed recounting of gangland feuds, one of the few places the book's pace seems to flag, until Sante recounts the engrossing tale of the infamous Murder, Inc. and the birth and development of what we now refer to as the Mafia, which got its start in the 1880s in New Orleans and began operations in New York a decade later. An amusing chapter titled Rubberneckers recounts the long and storied history of outsiders visiting our fair city to take in its unique cultural trappings, and then writing long-winded articles on how New York is a foul, corrupt hellhole. One theme that Sante returns to repeatedly in Lowlife is New York's fascination with itself. This is an amusing concept when you think about it, but I do think it goes beyond mere navel-gazing. There really is a particular obsession New Yorkers have with our fair city. It's a fascination that would drive Sante, who lived on the Lower East Side for a decade, to write a magnificently researched book on the architecture, layout of the streets, and cultural attractions of a bygone era of New York. Attractions that include, but are not limited to, gambling, drug use, saloon keeping, bare-knuckle boxing, prostitution of every kind, confidence scams, crooked cops, variety shows, murder for hire, corruption, depravity, stage acting, and much that is captivating to read about in the comfort of one's own home, but likely was considerably less enjoyable by the multitudes crammed into and around the bowels of old New York. And it's a fascination that drove me to read Lowlife and then jump through quite a few hoops in order to put this piece together, one more brick added to the edifice of self-aware New York self-fascination that is this entire project. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for another episode of NYC Foodways. Peace!